And I don't really think that the European Union knows where to draw the line. It just doesn't recognise boundaries of its own ambitions. The first time that the Foreign Secretary came to the dispatch box over the Ukrainian-Russian situation, I did say that I was very concerned that the European Union had a very overambitious agenda. There are those in the European Union who believe absolutely that the European Union can solve all these problems. In fact, it's quite often the problem rather than the solution. The European Union is not essentially anything like as democratic as people make it out to be. And the really important question is how to get real democracy into the Ukraine and at the same time to be able to reflect the views of the people of the Ukraine. Now, I don't believe that taking the Ukrainian entity into the European Union is actually the best way to go at all. And I say that it was intended originally in these association agreements and the Eastern Partnership Agreement seemed to me to be a stepping stone to getting the Ukraine into, first of all, the European Union, and by a gradual process, and then subsequently into NATO. And the fact is that going in this direction is bound to have an adverse effect on the attitudes of the Russians. We all want peace and stability, and I don't have any brief for Mr. Putin or Russian attitudes at all. But what I do say is that there are times when it's very important to understand as a matter of statesmanship what the reaction is going to be of taking certain steps which are bound to antagonize the people that you're dealing with and who you want to have a peaceful relationship with. And it's my view that actually by taking these steps of pushing the boundaries of the European Union towards Russia was bound to create difficulties. It's certainly true to say, as far as the Baltic states are concerned, and many of the other countries in the neighbourhood, that they have Article 5 status. And on that, there is no doubt that that is a very significant protection for them. But that does not apply to the Ukraine, and the relationship between Russia and the Ukraine has always been a very complicated one. And I do think it's very, very important to remember, particularly now, that mistakes were made in trying to push the boundaries of the European Union and its negotiating positions further and nearer to the Russian border, bound to lead to difficulties. I think it was a serious mistake. And people like Michael Lee of the German Marshall Fund have indicated that serious mistakes were made by the European Union. He said he was one of the architects of the policy, and there are many other people who have been commentating on this since, who have taken the view that the European Union has actually been part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Right. Can I ask you as well, while I don't want to cast doubt on the idea that the European Union is stupid, do you think that it's sufficient explanation of what's going on that the European Union did just blunder into this situation, or does it have a more precise objective? In simple terms, why does the European Union want Ukraine?
Well, I think that the European Union has a very overambitious idea of itself, and there never seems to be any limit either to the amount of power that it wants to take from member states in terms of their own national jurisdictions and their national parliaments on the one hand. I've just been at a conference in Athens, which I could summarise by saying that they insist on political union or bust. And you hear this from people like Vivian Redding, Barroso, the list is endless. And also now a defence union as well. And they're talking in terms of greater and greater ambitious programmes, when actually, when you look at the way the European Union is functioning at the moment, most people would say it's thoroughly dysfunctional. And it doesn't have all the democratic requirements In fact, it is exceedingly undemocratic in my view. And I don't really think that the European Union knows where to draw the line. It just doesn't recognise boundaries of its own ambitions. I think that they didn't so much blunder into it, although many people see the contradictions between what they said when they said there were misunderstandings about this association agreement and they could be sorted out. But actually, for practical purposes, they have a clear objective, and that clear objective is to absorb the Ukraine into a relationship with the European Union, which ultimately seems to me is a stepping stone to a much, much closer relationship, followed ultimately by going into NATO. And there are many, for example, in the United States, who have recognised the fact that NATO can actually become over-enlarged. But let me say that in fact, I'd rather see NATO taking an active part in relation to these very complex questions than I would the European Union. The European Union doesn't have the capacity to deal with these questions. The percentage of gross domestic product of defence in the respective member states is negligible, it's farcical compared to what is required to deal with these incredibly difficult problems. And I did put it to this conference, who would devise the European Union strategy if there were a defence union and a political union? What would be the purpose of that strategy? What would be the policy? And who would explain, particularly if it was to be ultimately dealt with by majority vote, to those parents of the young men and women who went to war and were killed in any conflict? Who would explain to them, who would be accountable for explaining why those people had been sent to war and what justification there was for it? In fact, on the whole of this issue, which is not exclusively about Russia and Ukraine, but about the whole business of the ambitions of the European Union, I have to say that I find them very wanting indeed. And I think that they are not only over-ambitious, but they are dangerously naive in their foreign policy as well.